On behalf of ADL New England, welcome to The Good Fight, a forum on confronting anti-Semitism today and tomorrow. I'm Robert Treston, ADL New England's Regional Director, and I'm thrilled to have you join us for today's program. Thank you to the Herman Dana Trust and to Combined Jewish Philanthropies for their generous sponsorship of this series. And thank you to our more than 20 community sponsors for being part of this effort. The Good Fight Forum began in 2019 as a commemoration of the one-year anniversary of the tragic shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. Our goal was to bring the community together to learn tools to confront anti-Semitism today and in the future. Building our skills to fight anti-Semitism is even more urgent now. In the next 30 minutes, you will be equipped with 5 tools you can use to combat anti-Semitism and hate. We hope you will find ways to implement these tools in your lives so that you too can be an agent for change in the good fight. Welcome to today's program. I'm glad to be joined today by Carol Rose, the Executive Director of the ACLU of Massachusetts, to discuss the timely topic of how we can hold elected officials accountable when they cross the line. And I'm so glad that Carol is here to share her insights and knowledge with us today. Carol is both a lawyer and journalist. She started her career as a reporter for United Press International, then worked for the Des Moines Register and the New York Times, with reporting stints in Washington, London, Japan, and throughout Central and South Asia. Upon returning to the United States, Carol attended law school and worked as a media, internet, and civil rights lawyer before taking the helm at the ACLU of Massachusetts. Under her leadership, the ACLU of Massachusetts has won historic law reform victories in the areas of racial justice, criminal law reform, immigrants' rights, voting rights, privacy protections, reproductive justice, LGBTQ equality, and freedom of speech. Carol's full bio is in the program description below. Holding our elected officials accountable is essential to a well-functioning democracy. Unfortunately, this year we've seen some extreme examples of elected officials crossing the line. We saw a school committee member refer to a former school administrator as using the K word. School committee members comparing vaccine requirements to the Holocaust. A city councilor making racist remarks. And a state representative in Maine comparing vaccine mandates to violations of the Nuremberg Code. In all of these instances, in my role as regional director at ADL, I've heard from many concerned community members who reiterate the same question: what can I do? And that's what I'm hoping that we're going to get into a conversation with today, Carol.
Great. Thank you so much, Robert. It's so great to be here. The ADL is such an important organization in our community and such an important ally to the ACLU. So it's really an honor and a privilege to be able to speak with you today. Thank you.
So let's dive right in. As someone who's been both a lawyer and a journalist, you have experience in multiple realms, multiple disciplines in holding people accountable, both in the legal sphere, but also, in your role as a past journalist. Tell us about a time when you used the law to hold elected officials accountable, and maybe a time when you used your role both as a journalist and that platform to hold people accountable.
Right. Well, it's interesting because, at the ACLU, we use what we call an integrated advocacy approach, where we try to use multiple tools in the toolkit, because we have found that the law alone, or media alone, or legislative work alone, or field work and mobilization alone often doesn't get the job done. But when we bring them together and we coordinate and we collaborate and align all of these tools in the toolkit, we actually punch far above our weight. And just a couple of examples. Like, one example was a couple of years ago, we found out that the Massachusetts public records law was broken. Substantively, while it could be better, that wasn't really the problem. The problem was there was no enforcement mechanism. And so as a result, a local town clerk who receives a public records request from some advocacy group or a private citizen seeking more information about our government, they had two choices. One is they could respond to it in which case they might embarrass their boss and spend a lot of time responding, or they could do nothing, in which case there was no enforcement mechanism. So we decided to use this integrated advocacy approach by mobilizing the media around it. We got, the Boston Globe and the Herald and the Quincy Patriot Ledger and all the other TNT and Springfield Republican, all come out and have editorial boards saying that this was wrong. We had people calling their legislators. We were filing lawsuits to say, look what happens when we aren't able to use the public records law. And ultimately, we went to the legislature and we got a fix, because that pressure together, that citizen pressure, that media pressure, that legal pressure together, we're able to get the legislature to realize that even though some of the town clerks were opposed to it, it was important to have an enforcement mechanism so that we could have a public records law that works and holds people accountable in Massachusetts. So that's just an example of how we work to bring the law and journalism and people power together to actually try to reform law and public policy.
I think it's a great example, Carol, because we know that access to information and providing the public access to what is going on, behind the scenes to a certain extent, it promotes a healthy democracy. I think what's troubling about what this story you just told us is that it took so much work, leveraging both the media, leveraging the law, and then mobilizing people to actually get hold of information that really everyone should be able to easily get in the first place.
Right. And what was also really important about fixing the public records law was that then provided a foundation for other fixes and accountability efforts that we wanted to take, because suddenly we have access to public records, and not just the ACLU, but all citizens and other groups and journalists have access to public records that we didn't have before we got this fix in the law. But it also just goes to your point, Robert, which is that these are not quick fixes. We have to really have a coordinated effort across all of these disciplines, if you would, and bring these together in a coordinated way. And then we have to work at it for a long time. I think that took 2 legislative cycles, so 4 years before we were able to get that law passed. On the other hand, when you look back over a decade, you say, look at all the things we accomplished, even though each one of them maybe took more time than what we would like to have it take.
I mean, the ACLU relies on lawsuits. So in holding, both people, elected people, and also like our government structure accountable like this, how do you decide which cases to take up?
Right.
And are there opportunities? I guess the second part of that is are there opportunities in those situations for people to also be mobilized? How do you find out which cases to take, and how do you make those decisions?
Right. It's a great question. And it's as much art as it is science, to be honest with you. So obviously, like all good advocacy groups like the ADL, we set priorities for a given year of what are the things we're working on. So for example, right now, our priorities include racial justice, voting rights, reproductive justice, and privacy. So if we then have lawyers who receive calls from people who say that they believe there's a rights violation taking place, if it falls into one of those categories in particular, we're likely to take a closer look at it as a potential case. And then the second thing that we do is we talk about whether or not there's an opportunity for systemic change. I always sort of think about our allies and our friends who are in the direct legal services world, and they're making sure every individual whose rights are violated has some form of representation. And that's incredibly important. And we work closely with those groups that do that. But the ACLU is a little different because we're a law and policy reform organization. So I think of it as akin to, if you look in the river and you see people coming down who are drowning in the river, and our first instinct is to go in and to rescue them. And that's incredibly important. But what we try to do at the ACLU is to say, why is it that people are coming down the river and drowning? And we try to go upstream and to look at the systemic reasons that that's happening to people. And so a good example of that might be with the drug lab scandals that took place. So we saw that lots of people were being locked up because of substance use disorder, but that there were problems with a lot of these cases. So we began to look behind, to go upstream, if you would, to find out what the systemic problems were. And in fact, discovered not 1, but 2 different drug lab scandals, and began to take a look at what that meant. And instead of saying, let's take each individual case one at a time, we went to the courts with a global proposal for a solution, which is that the government had to decide which were the really bad actor cases that they wanted to prosecute, and which were the ones that they weren't going to. And they couldn't do all of them because there were almost 100,000 different cases that had fallen under this abuse in the drug lab scandals. And so we did two things. One is we said, you have to address the problems in your drug labs as a systemic matter. And second, for all of these people who were wrongfully convicted, you have to either, the state has to take on individually one at a time, which is going to be hard to do, or we have to address this as a systemic matter, and they just vacated all of those cases. So we're looking for systemic, big picture reform to prevent the suffering in the first place, while collaborating and partnering with other organizations that do direct legal services or provide criminal defense work, the public defenders and things like that, to do the individual representation. And so we refer, if the case comes in and we're not able to take it because it isn't one of our priority issues, or because it doesn't really lead to systemic reform, we help those people to find legal counsel to make sure that they also have direct representation and that their rights are protected. But it may not be an ACLU case.
So I think the example you just gave with the drug lab, which really changed, it sort of rocked the entire Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the whole criminal system. It's also a reminder to me that when we talk, our topic about holding accountability, it's not always just sort of one particular individual. That accountability, we need to be thinking about it as systems and systemic issues that bring many, that impact, thousands potentially of people.
That's exactly right. And, it's not really just saying like there's one bad guy out there who's violating everybody's rights. Often it's a system that maybe grew up organically or grew up over time or historically, that now we need to take into account what that system has wrought. And that's a little bit of a different approach than saying, there are good guys and bad guys in the world and we're going to get the bad guys. It's really about bringing to light, again, using journalism, law, and people power to help people to understand that we need to do these deep systemic reforms to protect people's rights at a systemic level.
So legislative advocacy is one of the ways that these things happen. I want to raise what I think is probably a current topic, and that's around surveillance technology and facial recognition, which I know you're leading the charge on this issue. Right. I can sort of remember when in Brookline a couple of years ago, when they started putting cameras up in public places, people started asking questions. Well, what does this mean? And we're sort of living in an era when, the way we think about technology today is not the same way we thought about it 5 years, 10 years, maybe even a year ago. So tell us a little bit about how this, this issue fits into holding government accountable.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, technology is sort of like money. It's coming, it's changing. And so how do we respond to it? And how does public policy keep up with technology? And that's really hard because technology changes a lot faster than the law. But when it comes to face surveillance technology, the problem with that is that, which some people call face recognition, and I'll tell you there's a bit of a difference. But when it comes to that face surveillance technology, it's both really pernicious because it doesn't really work. And at the same time, it's pernicious even if it does. And so while we don't want to be Luddites and say we're anti-technology, it's important to recognize, so face recognition technology is the kind of thing that maybe you use to open your phone, right? There are reasons, or if you have somebody robs an ATM and you captured on a camera, you can try to look for their face. That's a little bit different than face surveillance, which is actually tracking us in real time. So it tracks you from that ATM to when you use your fast pass to when you walk down the street and there's a poll camera that's surveilling you, and the government tracks you and can see where you're going in real time. So for example, if maybe you're going to your Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, or maybe you're going to seek medical care that you want to keep private, or going to see your mistress, or whatever the reasons that we might want, or going to a rally, all the reasons that we want to have privacy and not be tracked without a warrant, or if we've done nothing wrong, that you don't want to have real-time tracking of people. So that's the thing that ACLU is fighting, is to make sure we don't have that real-time warrantless tracking. And so when I say that face surveillance technology is dangerous because it doesn't work fully, it actually has been shown to have real racist implications, because face surveillance, the algorithm the machine is trained on databases. And what happens when you train on a database that exists, it exacerbates the pre-existing racial disparities and biases that exist in your given database. And so because a lot of these are trained on certain kinds of databases, it's unable to do a good job of recognizing, for example, Black faces and women's faces. And so you have a real problem with instead of saying, well, the machine is more neutral than the people. The problem is the machine is trained on databases that were created by people that have biases, and it actually exacerbates those because it's constantly looking for the algorithm. A good example of that, not in the face context, but in other contexts, was Amazon decided to do a resume spotting. They wanted to find more employees, and so they said, here's the employees we've already hired. Let's see if we have some other people we can hire based on our past hiring practices. And the algorithm taught itself to start to exclude women. And so if you had something about, I was a women's studies major in the women's glee club or whatever it was, it would exclude that person, not because they programmed it to do that, but because the machine actually taught itself to do that. So it's those implicit biases that we don't necessarily recognize that the machines then exacerbate. So that's one problem with face surveillance technology, is it's not as accurate on certain faces as on others. And it really depends on what the database that it got trained on is. But even if it could do that, it still has that problem of the law needs to catch up with the technology. So in the legislature last year, what we found is that if we could put in some constraints, so saying things like you can't just use it in an unfettered way, law enforcement can't just use it to track people that maybe they don't like, and to say that there has to be some sort of a warrant requirement. Those are the kinds of things that we're pushing for now in the legislature to make sure that we get the benefits of this technology, but we don't get the detriments of it. And again, looking at systemic reform, so that we can not be Luddites, but at the same time not lose our civil liberties.
So I think it's an important balance. And I think we've seen many, many examples in the last few years where technology just gets so far ahead of where the law is. And just thinking about some of the examples we've talked about already, it takes a long time for the legislative process to catch up.
Right. But we'll get there. We just keep at it.
Well, that's a good segue to this sort of question, which I think a lot of us think about, and that's sort of more broadly speaking, what are ways for other people, individuals, people who live in our community who have these concerns? They also, they're all voters. So I guess number one is make sure that you vote.
Absolutely.
That is, that's a right we all have to hold our elected officials accountable, regardless of who you're voting for. But what about signing petitions, making phone calls in person, when we get to, back to a place where in-person meetings are common? What are some things that you and the ACLU recommend that people do to hold their local officials accountable?
Absolutely. And let me just say how important the people power is, and both in the legislative context, but also in the court context. And just to give you an example, in the legislative context, if when we ask people, and I know, again, ADL does the same thing, we ask people to sign petitions, or especially to call your legislator or to write to your legislator, it makes such a big difference. We'll have legislative people say, wow, I got 5 phone calls on this issue. And in the Massachusetts legislature, that's a lot. And so a very small number of people can have a really big impact. It doesn't have to be sort of in Congress where it's, thousands of people have to rise up, but it really makes a difference when they see that. Same thing with rallies and showing up and making your voice heard. It really makes a difference. Lobby days make a really big difference. On the public records law, for example, it made a really big difference that we had so many people who were raising their voice. And we had legislators say to us, all we thought we were going to get was the people who were opposed to it because it was a burden on the clerks. But when we had this big, people writing letters to the editor in the newspapers, people calling, people writing, signing petitions, it actually has a really big impact on what happens. The second way you can do it is to get involved in your town government. I mean, one of the things that makes, I think, New England and Massachusetts so particularly democratic, if you would, is that we have town government as opposed to county government, which occurs in most of the rest of the country. And in town government, you can actually get things done. So just by way of example, on the face surveillance technology, we had cities and towns in, I think, maybe a dozen different communities who actually passed bans, not just regulations, but bans on face surveillance technology. And that got the attention of people in the legislature. And then the third part I would just say that really matters is in the courts. You know, we like to think of the courts as just a place where the judges are calling balls and strikes, but that's not true. Judges are people too, and they read the morning paper and they see the letters to the editor and they see if there's been a rally or people speaking out about something. And, you know, I always think that the judges, when the Supreme Court or any court comes down with a decision, it's really after years of public work and advocacy work. And just think about gay marriage. Equal marriage is a good example of that. I mean, to think how quickly we went from 2004, when the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts first passed equal marriage, first in the nation here in Massachusetts, to 2015 with the Obergefell decision where we got it in the U.S. Supreme Court. You know, that was a very short amount of time in law reform terms, right? But it happened. The court is really the exclamation point on the end of a movement. The courts are conservative. Judges by nature are conservative. They don't want to change the law, but when they see the law is changing anyway, they often want to get ahead of it. And so I always think of people power as the most important thing that can happen in a movement that includes litigation, and that the courts are really putting the exclamation point at the end of that work.
And it still took multiple years of advocacy work.
Absolutely.
The Supreme Judicial Court here made that, historic decision. So
it really did. And, a lot of it was just storytelling, was having people come forward and tell the stories about their sons, their daughters, their loved ones, their, and featuring couples that had been together for 20 or 30 years and how their marriage, their being together, their union had nothing to do with anybody else's marriage, but was about them, and really humanizing and telling those stories. And that's where that journalism component, that people power component becomes so terribly important. Because if we're trying to change the public conversation, then we have an opportunity to change what happens in the courts. Now, I always like to say that they who set the frame win the game. And that's exactly what happened. When we changed the frame from one of fear to one of love, that's when we were able to win equal marriage in Massachusetts and then across the country.
So, storytelling and the courage that people have to tell their stories is certainly a part, I think, of holding elected officials or holding everyone accountable. I remember when ADL took on a position to support gay marriage in Massachusetts, it actually came after we met with people who told their stories, and it was almost instantaneous after that we developed a policy and got on started advocating quickly.
Yeah.
Go ahead. No, one of the things that we've seen a lot in the last 12 to 18 months, and even more recently, is things happening in school committee meetings. We mentioned this sort of town government model that happens. It's common in New England, particularly in Massachusetts. But we've seen things get really out of control with slurs, with racism injected, anti-Semitism, and the tension level definitely is rising. Any suggestions on how people can deal with that? I mean, when I think to some of the calls that we field in our office, and I'm guessing it may be the same for your team as well.
Yeah.
People call and they're like, "What can we do about this?" And you can sort of hear the anger in both the anger and the hurt in their voices.
Yeah, and justifiably. I think that two sort of techniques that I think are the most effective, and this is there's less of a legal than more of a sort of strategic advocacy response. In some instances, I think the best response is to actually shun the speaker. So, for example, when the Westboro Baptist Church people showed up with their anti-gay and racist and bigoted messages, there was a real conversation about, is the right thing to do to speak to them and give them more oxygen, or to turn our backs on them. And in some towns around Massachusetts, I think in Concord and Lexington, people showed up, but then they turned their backs, and they met them with silence, and they didn't give them any oxygen, if you would, and in doing so drove them away, because they were here to try to get publicity. And when they didn't get the publicity that they were seeking, they went away and they went somewhere else. So that's one technique, especially when there are outside agitator kind of groups that are bigoted, that are coming in. So sometimes ignoring, or collectively ignoring, is a good way to do it. But often the other is to have counter speech, and to have more speech, and to stand together, and to rise up together, and to speak on behalf of the people, and on behalf of those who are opposed to bigotry and intolerance, and to step forward, and then to hold out those who are to the sunlight, to the disinfection of sunlight, and to say, this is unacceptable in our community. Not to say we're therefore going to criminalize it, but to say it's not what we believe, and to vote them out of office, to mobilize and to move and to vote them out of office, because we shouldn't have tolerance for that. But the best response is to rise up and to get engaged ourselves, and to say, I'll run for the school board, I'll run for town meeting, I'll run for city hall, and make sure that those kinds of views are outvoted in a democratic process.
And I think we've seen a lot, in the last several years, a lot of people, stepping up and actually, running for office and becoming engaged. And, it's a good reminder that, you don't have to run for Congress, right, to become engaged. You just need to go down to your town hall, file papers, and you can have an influence, and you can have in your own community.
That's absolutely right. And even if you don't want to run, write letters to your paper, get engaged, whether it's the Globe or your local town paper. Raise your voice, be part of the public conversation, because if enough of us do that, then we counter those voices of hate and prejudice that we find so disturbing, and not to take it lying down, but to actually use our own voices to counter the voices with whom we disagree.
So I want to move to from the sort of town, the town hall to online, which is one of the places where we're,
it's huge.
There's a lot of vitriol, targeting, doxing of people that occurs in that space. How do we? I mean, this is a big one, and I don't know if we really know the answer to this question. But how do we start to rein that in? And I imagine it's a challenge, because I know that we just talked about speech. Speech is a two-way street.
Yep.
But how do we start to deal with the accountability online?
Well, I mean, it is a huge challenge. And just to be really clear, the ACLU is a free speech organization. Even the ACLU doesn't say there can be no regulation, right? We've never had a free-for-all. Freedom of speech doesn't mean a free-for-all. So there are instances when people are individually targeted, harassed, and things like that the law already has remedies. So we don't need to pass new laws to criminalize speech. We just have to use the laws that exist, and to make sure that if people are actually threatened directly or harassed, that the laws are used. So that's, just to be clear that we already have some remedies. Part of it is just using it. But there's just no question that some of these big companies, Facebook and Twitter, and they're just so large that they have really undue power. And so I think some of the conversations going on now in Congress and other places about regulating those companies, and maybe even using anti-monopoly law to help to make sure that individual companies don't have undue power over speech, and that they don't regulate, is really tremendously important. And I'm pleased to see that going forward. One of the things that I find most troubling right now is there's some conversation that, for example, if the former president Donald Trump, his accounts were suspended because he violated the terms of use for Twitter. And they're saying, well, if he becomes a presidential candidate, we'll have to give it back because he's a presidential candidate. And what that says is that if you are powerful enough, you don't have to play by the rules. And I think that's exactly the wrong message to be sending. We need to make sure that our elected officials and candidates who are running for office have to play by the same rules as the rest of us. that they're not allowed to violate the terms of use and terms of service just because they're a candidate or just because they're an elected official. And the other thing that we're finding, and if this happens to anybody, who's watching this, they should contact us, is that elected officials are then blocking people from their public forums if they don't agree with them. And that's not constitutional. If an official creates a public forum on a Twitter account, let's say, and other people go on it, they're not allowed to then silence them because they don't like their viewpoint. That too is a violation of the First Amendment. So it's very nuanced and complicated, but there are actually a lot of tools at our disposal to try to begin to prevent the kind of doxing and silencing of people they don't agree with by public officials.
So, on the terms of service, I'm sort of interested in that issue because when, former President Trump got suspended, that was like a big headline, I think, all over the world. Is adhering to the terms of, is that a good way to hold them accountable?
Well, I mean, it's one way that a private company like Twitter can hold them and all the rest of us accountable. There still creates a question as to whether or not any one company should have that degree of power. And so that's sort of the antitrust monopoly question. But I do think that if there are terms of service that apply to you and me, that they should apply to people who run for office as well. And so part of it is not saying, there's been a lot of talk about, well, we have to do exception handling because they're running for office. No, it's to the contrary. Elected officials are not above the law or below the law, but should actually be treated the same as everyone else in terms of the use of the tools that are available.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Carol, for sharing your experience and knowledge with us today. And we hope that the New England community and all those watching today are better equipped to take part in the good fight. For more content and tools on how to fight anti-Semitism, please go to adl.org. Next week, we are launching ADL's Never Is Now conference for combating anti-Semitism. And you can register and find more information at neverisnow.org. Wish everyone a good day. And, next week, I'll just sort of end with this. Next week, we have an election in Massachusetts. So one of the tools that we talked about in terms of holding people accountable is getting out there to vote. So encourage everyone to, if they're in Massachusetts, to vote next week.